broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to the Protecting Your Company in an Ever-Changing Regulatory Environment webinar.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you all for attending. Welcome. I'm excited to bring you this webinar today featuring our new member and purchasing consortium supplier, Clean Harbors. First, a little housekeeping. We are assisted today by my colleague, Erin Shank of Bio&J, who will run the mechanics of our webinar. This is a listen-only webinar, and you will be able to ask questions at the end of the presentation by typing your questions onto the screen. We will award the prizes after the webinar and inform you of the winners in an email as follow-up. If there are questions asked that we are not able to get to, we will address them in the email as well. In addition, we will post the webinar on our website in the very near future. A big part of our commitment to our members is to continuously bring value through programs like the Purchasing Consortium, where our members can realize quantifiable savings across critical business categories. And also by creating forums where members can learn from one another by accessing the newest industry information and standards and by sharing best practices. That is why we are here today. Human and environmental safety is critical to the life science industry. With R&D, regulatory requirements, and safety concerns, we know how important it is to prevent accidents, follow appropriate protocols, and react quickly and judiciously when there is a need. But we may not really know the correct procedures and best practices and what the costs and risks are associated with safety issues. In fact, with a laser focus on safety and regulations, we will see that there is much to be gained in terms of best practices and savings that can be reallocated across your businesses to things like R&D. An ever-present financial burdens of potential fines and regulatory risk can be minimized. My hope for you today is that you can learn something to take right back to your company from the presentation this morning and walk away with a few action items that can get you and your company started on your own course towards heightened safety, regulatory compliance, spend optimization, and risk mitigation. Environmental safety is a concern for all of us as responsible citizens and companies, and it can be a true competitive advantage for life science companies when given the right amount of focus and management. And today, I am thrilled to introduce to you Scott Kuhn, Vice President of Environmental Compliance with Clean Harbors Environmental Services. Scott joined Clean Harbors as part of the Safety Clean acquisition in September 2002. He is responsible for facility permitting and regulatory affairs, working closely with state and federal agencies on policy and regulatory issues. Previously, Scott served as Vice President of Compliance with Laidlaw Environmental Services Incorporated and Safety Clean Incorporated. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you, Linda. I really appreciate you having me here today, and I'm very excited to be with you and your group to discuss and share important information about environmental safety, which is becoming more critical and actually more complicated every day. I've been in this industry for a long time, essentially right out of college. I got into it when RCRA was brand new. It had just been authorized by Congress, and EPA hadn't even developed the regulations yet. So I've been into it really from the ground floor. So I'm hoping to pass on to your members and your folks some of my experience and knowledge in this area. And our goals and objectives for today are very simple. by the end of our session, you should be able to identify regulatory requirements for generators, discuss upcoming regulatory changes, and review environmental best practices. Next slide. Okay, first we'll start off at the beginning. What is a generator? What type of, because that really forms the basis of what is to follow and how you manage your waste products generated from your operations. The regulatory definition is as follows. It's any person by site who either first creates or produces a hazardous waste, such as from an industrial or commercial process, or first brings a hazardous waste into the RCRA subtitle C system through an import from another country. I'm not sure from this group if the second part of the definition would apply, but if so, then there are special requirements for imports. Okay, once you have determined that you're a generator, you have to wonder, where do I go for the information that I need and know what to comply with? Well, EPA has published numerous regulations for dealing and managing hazardous waste, and the relevant sections are on your screen right now. They're found in the Code of Federal Regulations in Title 40. The primary sections applicable to your operations would be in Subpart 260, which deals with hazardous waste management general requirements, Section 261, identification and listing of hazardous waste, and Section 262, which are actually the standards applicable to all generators of hazardous waste. And we'll be going through these as we move forward today. Now, if you wonder where you can find these Code of Regulations, they're certainly available in print, but it's always easier to try to find them online. And there is a website for the Code of Federal Regulations, which give you not only these regulations, but any environmental or actually government regulation you may need. It's easily found by just Googling Code of Federal Regulations, and then from there you should be able to navigate to find what you're exactly needing. Okay, first part as a generator. You've established that you're a generator of waste. Your process generates waste and you are considered a generator. Whether or not this material that you're generating is regulated under the RCRA program or is considered a hazardous waste, it would be the next step in determining what you have to do. And this waste determination is a four-step process. You've got to ask yourself some basic questions. Is my waste a solid waste as it's defined in the regulations? Secondly, is my waste excluded from RCRA regulation under another section? Is my waste listed in subpart D of part 261? And then does my waste exhibit a characteristic of subpart C in part 261? And we'll briefly discuss each one of these. Once you've determined, again, that you're a generator and you're generating a waste, the matrix that we have up there is really the best way to determine whether your material is first determined to be a solid waste. And that really is the key for everything, is first determining, is your waste a solid waste? Because if it's not a solid waste, then it can't be a hazardous waste. So as a generator, you would go in this table, and this table is in the regulations in Part 261, and the regulations provide definitions of all these terms: spent materials, sludges exhibiting a characteristic, byproducts, etc. So all of these are defined in the regulations, and the thing as a generator to do is then, again, using the top part of the matrix, how is that material being managed? Is it, again, use constituting disposal, energy recovery or fuel, reclamation, or speculative accumulation? Now on the matrix, as you get into the depth of the matrix where there's check marks and you have intersections of, say, spent materials, energy recovery, you see a check mark there. That would indicate that if you have what's defined as a spent material and it's used for or disposed of via energy recovery or use in a fuel, that material would be a solid waste. If you go down to one of the other ones, say a sludge exhibiting a characteristic of hazardous waste, and it's being reclaimed, you see just a hash mark there, and you see some hash marks further down under that reclamation. For all those things where there are hash marks, that indicates your waste is not considered a solid waste. Now again, if you solid waste, you have a solid waste or a material that's not considered a solid waste, it can't be a hazardous waste, and you are free to dispose of the material in the best way that you can, usually through Subtitle D or a non-hazardous landfill or other kind of treatment process. So this would be the place to start. You would look at the matrix, determine what your material is, how it's classified, then how it's managed. And then from there you determine if it's a solid waste or not. Now, once your material is determined to be a solid waste, there are some specific exclusions on whether it's both a solid waste or a hazardous waste. If you've got any one of these things under these particular exclusions, your solid waste is not regulated by RCRA, it's not considered a solid waste, or on the right side, it's not considered a hazardous waste. For example, if your operations produce processed scrap metal, you're producing scrap metal from your operation through shredding or anything, scrap metal is not considered a solid waste, and you're not subject to any regulations under RCRA. If you're recovering oil, if you're a petrochemical facility and you're recovering oil, that would not be considered a solid waste, and you're excluded from any regulations in RCRA. For hazardous waste, if you've determined you're a solid waste, but the materials on the right-hand side are specifically excluded from being a hazardous waste. So any of this material, if you've got this, you produce these things, you would not be considered a hazardous waste, although you could be a solid waste. Whoop, sorry, skipped ahead one. Now, the next step in the process would be you've determined you've got a solid waste. You're not excluded specifically under any of the exclusions that I discussed earlier. You then have to determine, is my waste hazardous? There's two ways of doing this, or two things you have to do, two steps you have to follow to go through this. First, you have to determine if your waste is specifically listed in the regulations as being a hazardous waste. And there's basically three categories of listed hazardous waste. One is waste from non-specific sources, which are designated F codes. And this generally, and probably these would apply mainly to you, may be your solvent wastes. Any solvents you're doing from material cleaning, tank cleaning, container cleaning, bottle cleaning. If you're generating a spent solvent, that would be considered a listed hazardous waste with an F code. The next category would be specific sources. These are K codes. These are generally waste produced from specific types of manufacturing or resource production operations, such as petroleum refineries, distillation, chemical manufacturing. Examples would be, say, catalysts from petroleum refinery operations. They are specifically listed from that. The next major category is then two subcategories. These are discarded commercial chemical products. These would be things that you're buying, say, from your suppliers, your chemical suppliers, that you use in your manufacturing operation, and maybe something has reached an expiration date and is unused, that you have to get rid of because you can't use it anymore, or it's been sitting around for years and you just need to get rid of it. That would be a discarded commercial chemical product. Something like maybe acetic acid or acetone, certain alcohols. There are two subcategories for these. P-coated wastes, which are considered acute toxic waste. Barium cyanide, fluorine are two good examples. And then less toxic, what they call U-codes, which would be things such as benzene or acrylic acids. Now, you've gone through that first part of the determination. You found that you may or may not have a listed waste. You then got to go through the second part of it, which is determining whether you've got a characteristic. And the characteristics are basically properties of these wastes. Something that's ignitable, corrosive, maybe reactive, or maybe contain a specific toxic chemical. And there's 39 of those, which are things like lead, mercury, selenium, vinyl chloride, etc. Now, the thing to recognize with that is, though, is that you could have a listed waste that your operation produces, but it could also have characteristics. So you really got to go through both determination. You can have a listed waste, which is also characteristic. And if that's the case, then you have to dispose of it considering both the listing and the characteristic. But if your waste isn't listed, it can still be characteristic, and you have to dispose of it accordingly. Oops, excuse me. Now, again, going through the process, you've determined as a generator that you produce something that's a solid waste. You've done your evaluations. You're not subject to any exclusions. You've gone through the hazardous waste determination. You have a hazardous waste you produce. The next part that you've got to look at is what is your status? And there are three categories of generators in the regulations. One is considered a CESQG, a conditionally exempt small quantity generator, a small quantity generator, and a large quantity generator. And what your classification is will depend upon how much waste you're generating in a month's time. CESQGs, if you're generating less than 100 kilograms a month, you'd be in that category. Small quantity generators between 100 and 1,000, large quantity greater than 1,000. Now, your category, as I said, depends upon the volume you produce. Now, once you've determined what size generator you are, that's when the regulations start giving you things that you have to comply with. You have to obtain an EPA ID number. You're limited on what you can accumulate on site at any one time, and for how long you can accumulate it. What the storage requirements are for how you manage that material, where you have to send it for disposal, and whether or not you have to use a hazardous waste manifest, which is, we'll discuss later, is the shipping paper for that. So again, just to review, you determine what waste you generate, you determine your size status, and from all of that, the rest follows of what you have to do as far as compliance with the regulators. There's some more requirements for each of these size generators. Reporting requirements, both EPA and or the state, on how much you generate in a year's period, whether you've got to have training for your people, whether you have to have a contingency or emergency plan with emergency procedures, and then whether you have to follow certain DOT requirements. Another classification of waste in there is something called universal wastes. Universal waste, as the slide says, are hazardous wastes that are subject to special management provisions. And these have been set up to ease basically the management burden on generators and facilitate recycling or proper treatment of such materials. And universal wastes are generally very common things that are generated by a lot of different types of generators, hence the name universal. Right now there are 4 classifications federally regulated as universal waste. Hazardous waste batteries, pesticides that are either recalled or collected in waste pesticide collection programs, mercury-containing equipment such as thermostats, scientific equipment such as barometers or manometers, and then hazardous waste lamps. Now, certain states may have their own lists that add on to that. But these are the ones that the federal EPA has determined are their universal wastes. Again, getting a little bit more into that, there's classifications for universal waste generators. So if you're generating one of these universal wastes, there's small quantity handlers and large quantity handlers. And again, it depends upon the amount that you generate on site during a specific amount of time. And then again, the table gives you what the requirements are as far as having to obtain an EPA ID number, how much you can accumulate, how long you can store it, whether a manifest is required for shipment, and what kind of training you have to have for your people that are handling this material. As I indicated, states may add additional universal waste to the state program. Cathode ray tubes is an example that a number of states have added, but not all. Interesting part too is that if you send universal waste to a TSD facility, treatment, storage, or disposal facility for management, while the generator and the transporter are, subject to reduced standards, destination, treatment, storage, disposal facilities have to comply with the full requirements on how they manage it. So the TSD facilities don't get a break. Another aspect of being a waste generator is satellite accumulation. Now, the regulations allow generators to accumulate small quantities of hazardous waste at or near the point of generation during your daily operations. Say if you had a workstation that you're doing a preparation or you're doing a task that generates a small quantity of waste as a result of that operation, you can accumulate that right in the area of that workstation. And while there's no real regulations on, say, how far away that satellite container can be, it has to be basically within the control of the person that's generating the material. Basically, it has to be located right in the general area where that person is working. Now, some of the conditions for doing satellite accumulation: you can accumulate up to 55 gallons of hazardous waste, or 1 quart of acute, which is that P waste I was telling you about, at each satellite accumulation area. And within a factory or within a laboratory, you can have several of these satellite accumulation areas, but again, it has to be under the control of the person at the workstation. You have to label the container, identifying the contents, and then once you've accumulated the maximum amount, at 55 gallons, you have to date the label on the accumulation space for dating it, and move the container to your central storage area within 3 days. And a very important part of this is you got to keep the container closed at all times, except when you're adding waste to it. Okay, let's just recap a bit. You've determined your hazardous waste generator. You're generating a listed and maybe a characteristic waste. You've got maybe some universal waste you're generating. You need to move that material now off-site. So there's requirements that the generator has to be aware of for what we call pre-transport preparation. And basically, that is to make sure that the material is packaged and labeled and marked appropriately and in compliance with DOT regulations. And EPA has adopted into their regulations the DOT requirements for proper packaging, labeling, marking, and placarding of the transport vehicle. And the DOT regulations can be found in 49 CFR parts 172, 173, 178, and 179. Again, you can find those online in that in the general website for the Code of Federal Regulations. So you've got your material packaged now. It's ready to be shipped. Under normal circumstances, maybe for material coming into your sites, or if you have something that is you're shipping off-site a product, you would use a DOT bill of lading for that. Well, EPA has a special form for that called the Uniform Hazardous Waste Manifest. And that manifest is basically a shipping paper, but it does have a lot more information on it than your standard bill of lading. And basically, it allows all parties involved with the hazardous waste management activities, both generators, transporters, receiving facilities, the EPA and the state agencies, to track the movement of hazardous waste from your sites to the site where the waste will be treated, stored, or disposed. Once that material has been shipped and sent to the facility for management, the owner and operator of that treatment facility must sign and return a copy of the manifest to you. And then, again, this is designed to ensure that you've got documentation that the material has been received at the site and is there, rather than a transporter taking it and then just dumping it along the side of the road, which was not too an uncommon practice back in the 60s and early 70s before RECL was put into place. Again, the manifest requires a lot of information on it: name, address, EPA ID number, the hazardous waste generator, transporters, and designated facility, the DOT description of the waste, and the quantities of the waste transported. And then it also has a certification, and this is very important that you understand this, that contains a certification that states the shipment has been accurately described and is in proper condition for transport. That is something that you as a generator will have to sign, and you really need to make sure that you know what you're signing, because the EPA could come back to you if there was a problem en route where the material was not packaged or labeled or described properly on the shipping document. So again, I advise caution and making sure you read and review the document before you sign it. Now, companies such as Clean Harbors, we will actually provide the manifest for you, and if you're using us, or I know some of our competitive facilities, companies do the same thing, they will come to you with a pre-printed manifest where we know all the information on there. We provide all the information, the shipping information, waste codes, etc., based upon the profiles that you complete for us. And then all you have to do is sign it, and then our transporter will sign it as well. But again, I urge you need to review it and make sure it's correct, because again, you're responsible for any errors that would be on it, really, even if the disposal company is filling that manifest out for you. Another aspect to consider is land disposal requirements. And you might ask, what are these? My material doesn't go to landfill. Well, even though you may not be sending it to landfill directly or sending it to a treatment facility that is ultimately treating it, and maybe their material has to go to a landfill for final disposal, that is an activity that's regulated, and there are requirements for generators on that. And basically, these land disposal restrictions are requirements are for or cover the disposal of hazardous waste in land-based units such as landfills, and is established by EPA to protect human health and the environment. And the goal is to make sure that the material can be safely land disposed in order to prevent groundwater contamination. And to do that, there's a two-tier approach to that. One is EPA has established specific design standards for landfills, double liners with groundwater monitoring and leachate collection and treatment. And then also, and probably the one that affects you folks most, is a requirement that any hazardous waste undergo physical or chemical treatment, so it poses less of a threat to groundwater, surface water, and air when disposed. So typically material such as you generate waste solvents and stuff may go for incineration disposal. And if that's the case, the material is incinerated, say in one of our or our competitors' incinerators, but then as a result of that incineration, it does produce a quantity of ash or residues that have to be disposed of. So while the incineration is considered one of these treatment operations, we have to assure that that residue that's left over meets the land disposal standards prior to us land disposing of it. The area where you folks get involved is that it's your job to evaluate your waste to determine whether, as generated, it meets the treatment standards or it doesn't before you ship it off site. And then if you determine it does not, you have to notify with the first shipment of your waste to the receiving facility that the material does not meet the treatment standards and can't be land disposed as is. And then you keep a copy of that on file. And if your waste changes or something changes with your process, you have to do a subsequent notification of that. So you're basically telling the company that's doing the incineration or other treatment what the treatment standard is that they have to achieve and that your waste doesn't meet it as generated. Now, if it does meet it, you can land dispose it directly. You have to sign a certification stating as such. And you better be able to document that how you made that determination, and because EPA could come back and ask for that. While there's no required form for LDR notification, there is specific language, and most of the waste disposal companies have their own forms that we use. Now, I've covered the basic stuff for the generators, your manifesting LDR requirements, waste determination, universal wastes, your generator status. And you would think that that would pretty much cover everything that you do. Well, there's some other things involving hazardous waste generation that aren't as obvious that also affect generators. One is that if you're a large quantity generator and you store your waste in tanks or you do on-site treatment or recycling, you could subject yourself to RCRA's air emission standards, which are in 40 CFR 264 subparts AA, BB, and CC. And those are specific technical requirements for how materials are generated or managed for treatment or storage in containers, tanks, and your recycling units. If you store waste on site for greater than 90 days, you're subject to RCRA permitting and all of the standards that would apply to a normal commercial treatment, storage, disposal facility, including financial assurance and closure requirements and any corrective action for your site. And then another one is if you generate and waste and either manage it on site or send it off site for management, you could be subject to reporting under EPCRA's toxic release inventory regulations for that waste. And the interesting thing about the TRI reporting is that it's not dependent upon generator status. You could be an LQG, SQG, or CESQG. It's really dependent upon the chemicals that you're managing or disposing of and how much. Another aspect is certain chemicals and hazardous waste, primarily the P wastes, are subject to regulation under Department of Homeland Security chemical security requirements. And that is something that we've had to get involved in as a company and evaluate all of our sites that manage waste from generators and such to see if we have to put in place any kind of special security requirements to prevent theft or kind of sabotage even. Finally, again, depending upon the size of your operations, what your operations are involved in, the chemicals in the waste may be subject to requirements of the Risk Management Program under the Clean Air Act. So those are some of the other regulatory things that you could be subject to. Some upcoming things that I thought you'd find interesting that's on the horizon is the electronic manifest. You may have seen, if you follow the Federal Register and you keep it on top of the regulations, back in last year in February, they published a final rule to allow the use of electronic manifests and establish a framework for developing an electronic system for compiling electronic manifest information, and I've provided the Federal Register citation. Thing that's interesting about this is that EPA has been exploring development of an electronic manifest system with various stakeholders in the hazardous waste management industry and Department of Transportation and big manufacturing companies for the last 15 years. I know in talking to other generator groups, this was a shock to them when they saw this. They didn't realize how long this has been going on, and then how much work EPA has been doing. And in 2013, they had a number of stakeholder meetings in cities across the U.S. Unfortunately, they weren't very well publicized. They showed up in the Federal Register, and that's about it. And while they were attended well, again, in my discussions with other generator groups, there were a lot of people that seemed to have felt they were left out of the discussion. They've also had, in 2014, a number of online webinars similar to this, where they were getting into the discussions of the specifics of what the system is going to be and how it's going to work. And again, they were not very well attended. The waste industry was there. Again, the big generators were there. But one of the complaints I heard about that is that they didn't really advertise it very well, and I tend to agree with them on that, with the folks on that. Another big thing coming down the pipe is, well, here's the one more thing on the manifest. Basically, it's going to automate the current paper manifest and will track the manifest through shipment, throughout the shipment from the generator site to the TSD. It'll capture data in a central data repository and basically report back to the system every time a manifest is signed on by a new party. Now, the e-manifest will be able to be completed on a computer or a handheld device such as a tablet, and it's going to be coordinated with DOT requirements and initiatives that they're taking independently. In fact, DOT is looking at making electronic the requirement for bills of lading. So if EPA and DOT can get their timing right, we could have a system that's totally devoid of the need for paper, which I think is a good thing. Now, the timing on this particular rule has been slipping. EPA hopefully had plans to have this system up and running and implemented by 2016. And from the latest information I have on this, that has slipped late 2018, maybe even into 2019. So work is proceeding, but it's proceeding slowly, and deadlines are slipping on that. So it's not something we're going to see very, very soon, but it is worth your time to kind of get, if you're not aware of this, to get caught up on some of the information that's available on EPA's website. And I urge you guys to go onto that site and get up to speed on where they are. Next thing is redefinition of solid waste is coming. Those of you in New Jersey may be aware that there was a rule that came out in 2008 that came out just before the last election, and what EPA did was they were basically directed back by the Obama administration to go back and reevaluate the rule for environmental justice issues to ensure that the rules were not putting undue burden on minority and low-income populations. And actually, when they went back and did the analysis of the rule, they found that it kind of did. So the new rule that came out in I think it was December, has some changes to it to make it again more compliant with environmental justice goals. And it changed. One of the big changes I put here is this transfer-based exclusion, which would allow a generator sending material to a an off-site recycler to exclude their material from being considered a hazardous waste. They took that out and replaced it. They kept the concept, but they took out the specifics and put in a requirement that material that is sent to what's called a verified recycler would be excluded from being a hazardous waste, but there are certain requirements for these verified recyclers that they have to demonstrate, some of which is they have emergency response and preparedness requirements, in some cases permits, and tracking mechanisms for what comes in and basically what goes out. Now, this rule goes into effect federally in the middle of June of this year. However, states have to adopt it, similar to what had to happen in 2008. And the states that did adopt the 2008 rule have to adopt the new provisions of this. So for those of you in New Jersey, and if they're Pennsylvania, Illinois, the states that did adopt it, you're going to see the states scrambling around to try to make changes so that they keep the program going. But they're going to be challenged to get this in and done by June. Where this one sits currently is I was in a meeting in Washington, D.C. last week, and I've got some more information to talk about that. But I was in a meeting with EPA, and we were discussing this issue, and I learned that there are at least 6 lawsuits against the rule here, that the people are challenging it. So depending upon how the EPA responds to those lawsuits and the exact nature of the lawsuits, we may see that the whole thing is deferred again, so it doesn't go into effect until the lawsuits are addressed, or you might see EPA adopt it and have to resolve the concerns that are addressed in the lawsuits on a case-by-case basis. How that's affecting the states is that the states may do like what they did in 2008. They might say, we're not adopting it until all the lawsuits and all the controversy is done. So if you follow, the environmental arena, keep your eye on this one to see exactly what your states are doing and where the lawsuits are with this, because it will affect whether it'll be actually ever implemented. Next one, I was in as I said, I was up in a meeting in Washington, D.C. with our trade association, and we had some EPA people come in and give us kind of an update on things. And they provide us with some information on a new rule that's going to be proposed this summer. It's called the Generator Improvement Proposed Rule. And basically what EPA is doing is they are reviewing all of the generator requirements that we just spent our time going over and revising them. They realize that the generator regulations, for the most part, haven't been modified in over 30 years, and it was time for some fixes. What they're going to try to do is they're going to try to really improve the program's efficiency, effectiveness by doing a few things. They're going to clarify certain components of the generator regulatory program, totally reorganize the regulations to make them more user-friendly. They'll provide generator flexibility for certain types of generators, and then strengthen environmental protection by addressing what they perceive as gaps in the regulations. Now, the highlights of what they're going to be looking at is hazardous waste determination documentation. Basically, they're going to make it more, put more requirements on how we determine whether our wastes are hazardous or not, especially if they're not hazardous. We didn't get what the specifics are going to be, but we envision that they're going to be they're going to really define what constitutes things like generator knowledge, which you can use to make your determination, being able to document how you're making the decisions that your waste is or is not a hazardous waste. they're going to be addressing labeling for small quantity generators and large quantity generators in order to better provide information to, say, emergency responders that may be responding to, say, incidents along the road or in rail cars or something that are used to transport these materials. And again, I think what we might see is additional information on the labels that are required to be put on the drums. They're going to address periodic generator notification, where it's they're going to require that as a generator, you have to provide a notification that you are a generator and what your size is. You do that when you initially become generator, and there's no regulatory requirement to do it again unless a major change is done. Well, I think what they found is that their database of generators that are out there in the United States is woefully inadequate and inaccurate. So they're going to be looking at requiring maybe biennial re-notification of all generators so that their databases are up to date. They'll be addressing episodic generators. Now, what's an episodic generator? If you are a conditionally exempt small quantity generator, or normally a small quantity generator, you always generate very small quantities of this, so you get into these kind of less onerous categories. But for some reason, for an unexplained reason, or it's something that's just totally never happens, but once you generate a quantity of hazardous waste that kicks you into the large quantity generator. Well, that has its own ramifications where you now have to have all these things with again, maybe generator notification, getting an EPID number, providing training to your people. But then you do this one incident, and then you go back to life as normal as a CESQG. And that causes problems in the generator industry, this one-time or very rare instances on how to deal with it. And most generators in the small categories totally unprepared. So what they're going to do is they're going to be providing some flexibility in the rules for generators that are normally in these lower categories, and then there's an irregular event where you generate more waste than normal. Also, they're going to address consolidations of CESQG waste. Now, what this is that if, say, a company has a number of small facilities in say, a city or in a state, and they're all CESQGs, they're looking at maybe provisions to allow this company to have a central accumulation area or location where all the CESQGs can send to this accumulation location, and without having to worry about the size, and the company can then manage the accumulated waste from all the small generators and send it out, say, as one shipment. It makes some sense from a logistics standpoint and from a better management standpoint. So, and it's a similar situation maybe like in the retail sector where they have, say, Walmart has a dozen stores in the region, and rather than having to ship out to a TSD all the material from these individual stores, it'll allow, say, Walmart to establish an accumulation location where the individual stores can send it, still maintaining the CESQG status, and then the accumulation location would send a large shipment out as a large quantity generator. Right now, there's really no provisions for doing that easily. So those are the 5 big things on that. This rule is currently at the Office of Management Budget for its 90-day review, and assuming that OMB passes it on, we expect publication sometime in the late summer of 2015. Again, this is another one that would be worth your time to keep in your back of your mind to review when you sometime this summer. And the best way to do this is look at it, review it, and then if there's things in there you don't like, either through your association or as an individual company, submit comments. Some environmental best practices to kind of wrap things up, again, from our experience in the industry, my personal experience. Coordinate purchases of chemicals and materials used in your operations to determine what types of waste you're going to be generating from these chemicals. Again, it involves operations, purchasing, engineering. In this way, you can, maybe find less toxic substitutes. You can find stuff that's easier to dispose of or that's easier to recycle. So it's really kind of a life cycle kind of approach to coordinate things at the front end of your operations with those at the back end. So that's one of the first things I think is important for all of us. As I mentioned earlier, generators can use knowledge to determine whether a waste is hazardous instead of analysis. But as I mentioned with this new rule that's coming out, it's always advisable that you document what the basis of that knowledge is, whether it's process chemistry, MSDS information, or if you have analysis that, say, sister companies have done of their material. But you really need to be able to document how you determined the status of your waste, whether it's hazardous or non-hazardous. Again, train all employees involving hazardous chemicals and waste, even if you're not required to by regulation. You're thinking, you might think that your people handling chemicals can, they don't need to know, what hazardous requirements are, but it only takes one punctured drum or a spilled 5-gallon pail to generate a large quantity of hazardous waste when you factor in what you have to do the cleanup. So if your people are trained to manage hazardous chemicals and waste and have a realization in there that safe handling can avoid cost and avoid risk, which is really what we're all here for, it's definitely worth the effort. Along with that, establish an inspection program for your operations, generating hazardous waste and storage locations. Again, it's to make sure that your processes are operating properly, that hazardous wastes that are being generated are properly being packaged and described and disposed. And you can do it on paper, you can do it electronically, depending on the complexity of your site and your people's computer savviness. And then conduct regular inspections of your sites. Another thing is, I mentioned about universal wastes. A common misconception with universal wastes are they equate that universal wastes are non-hazardous. This is not true. Universal wastes are not non-hazardous, and they have to be managed properly according to the universal waste rules. And as I said, this is a major misconception with generators, and we see at our facilities a lot where a generator will classify something that's a universal waste as non-hazardous. We pick it, we detect it, we have to go back and correct it, and that just gets complicated because we have to contact the generator, let them know that there's an issue with this, and nobody likes to get those calls. Waste batteries. Best thing, advice I can give on if you generate any waste batteries, tape the terminals before you dispose of them. I've seen instances where people stack up batteries that they're getting ready to dispose of, putting them side by side and the terminals are untaped. Now those terminals, especially if the negative is near the positive, they can arc. And if you have arcing like that, they can cause fires. And it's especially dangerous if you generate any lithium batteries. The reason for that is if they do have a tendency to arc, and once those lithium batteries catch fire, they are very difficult to put out. And that could be a disaster. Again, be prepared for spills and emergencies at your sites. Train your people on proper cleanup procedures. And finally, for satellite containers, make sure you keep them closed when not adding or removing waste and label them properly. Don't date the label until it's full. All of these are easy gotchas for regulators when they come out and inspect your facilities. Okay, we are, as part of our commitment to your organization, to you, we are going to be providing complimentary environmental audits to you, to any of you that attended the seminar today, the webinar, and as a member, your firms receive Clean Harbor Service discounts. Now, I'm not the guy to deal with that. The best person to deal with that would be John Kelsey, and he may be on this call, and he's the Vice President of our Pharmaceutical, Biotech, and Healthcare Industries sector, and his contact information is there. Now, I'm going to open it up to questions. Anybody have any questions?
Hi, Scott. We do have a question.
Okay.
What are the main 2 to 3 concerns of a biotech company related to hazardous waste management?
I think those would be in your waste determination area. Again, determining what you're generating, the types of materials that you're generating, whether it's it most likely wouldn't be a listed material, but would be characteristic. I mentioned that, you know, you can use it, make a determination using knowledge, but for characteristics, it's unless you have specific information from an MSDS or some testing that's done, it's kind of hard to determine that, and you may have to resort to testing. So again, waste determination is a big one. The satellite accumulation, definitely. You know, if you've got workstations around your manufacturing, making sure that those satellite accumulation areas, containers are sealed, labeled properly. I think those are the big ones. And again, determining your generator status and being very, very careful about the one thing I mentioned about jumping from, if you're a CESQG or small quantity, jumping up to that LG large quantity generator and getting then subject to all sorts of additional requirements you may not have expected. And the way EPA looks at this, and this is another thing I learned in this meeting we had with them, that if for these small guys that jump up to large quantity, EPA looks at that as you're in it for a year. Even though, like, maybe for months afterwards you jump back in status, the EPA has a tendency to view that once a large quantity, always a large quantity for at least a year. They don't say that in the regs, but that's their kind of thinking. So those are the ones I'd be concerned about.
Great. We have time for one more question. The question is, I have heard of cradle to grave. What does that really mean?
Okay, that's interesting, and I'll try to be brief because it does get complicated. Basically, it ties in with the hazardous waste manifest, where the hazardous waste regulations under RCRA cover the management of hazardous waste from cradle, which is the point of generation, to the final disposal. And so that comes the term cradle to grave. Well, what that really means for a generator is that a generator is liable for his hazardous waste and how it's managed from the point it's produced at their location to final disposal. Now, you might think that sending it to a TSD facility for management, for incineration, landfill, what have you, resolves you of that liability. In truth, it does not. You're liable for your material. You're responsible for how your material is managed all the way to the end, and that's where another regulation called Superfund kicks in, that for some reason, say if you send your material to a hazardous waste company, it goes out of business, your waste, even though it's been incinerated and the residue sent to the landfill, if there's a problem at that landfill, you can be held responsible for the results of that mismanagement at the landfill. So a generator never escapes responsibility for his material.
Okay. Thank you, Scott.
Great.
And thank you again, everyone, for attending and for all of your questions. If we did not get to your question, we will have Scott addressed them after today's call, and we will share the answers in that same email mentioned earlier where we will provide the playback information. And for those of you who are BioNJ members, we will be conducting the gift card drawing, and we will announce the winners in that email as well. This concludes our program. Thank you, Scott Kuhn and Clean Harbors, for leading us through an amazing and comprehensive presentation.